Celebrations are underway across the United Kingdom as we approach midnight.
Of these islands, people are waiting in their own ways. Here outside Cardiff City.
Good evening to you. The Northwest's gearing up for its biggest ever party. Thousands are pouring into the centres of Manchester and Liverpool for the festivities, and towns and villages across the region are joining in with their own Millennium Night celebration.
And in Birmingham Centenary Square.
At Greenwich, home of time, the largest dome in the world is ready for Britain's most spectacular party.
We at News Channel 8 have been preparing for Y2K. Oh, we don't want to sound...
The end of a decade has a strange way of making everything feel more important. As 1999 arrived, it wasn't just another year on the calendar, it was the closing chapter of the millennium, and everywhere you looked, the future seemed closer than ever before. Mobile phones were becoming smaller, home computers were becoming faster, the internet was slowly weaving itself into everyday life, films and television couldn't stop imagining what the next century might look like, and the closer the clock moved towards the year 2000, the more it felt as though technology itself was accelerating. Video games were no different. Only 5 years earlier, the original PlayStation had arrived as an outsider. A company better known for televisions and hi-fi systems had stepped into an industry dominated by Nintendo and Sega, asking players to believe in something completely new. It was a gamble that could have easily have failed. Instead, it changed everything. By the beginning of 1999, the PlayStation wasn't simply successful, it had become the place to play. Its games filled shop shelves across the world, third-party developers built their biggest projects around it, publishers no longer wondered whether PlayStation could support ambitious ideas, they assumed it would. Millions of consoles were already sitting beneath televisions, memory cards filled with completed adventures, favourite saves, and countless afternoons that nobody wanted to erase. The grey machine that once felt like the future had quietly become part of everyday life, and yeah, success has an unusual habit. The moment you reach the top, people stop asking how you got there, they start asking who might replace you. For the first time since Sony entered the console business, genuine questions about the future were beginning to appear. Sega had returned with remarkable confidence, bringing a new console that looked unlike anything players had seen before. Gaming magazines filled with impossible screenshots and promises of arcade-quality experiences at home. Across the industry, whispers about Sony's next machine were becoming impossible to ignore. Even personal computers were beginning to produce worlds that seemed larger, sharper, and more connected than ever before. The industry wasn't standing still, it was preparing to change all over again. There was every reason to believe the original PlayStation might finally be approaching the end of its story. History had other ideas, because while everybody looked towards tomorrow, PlayStation was quietly preparing for one of the greatest years of its entire life. This wasn't a console desperately clinging to relevance, it wasn't surviving on momentum or familiar franchises. If anything, the opposite was true. Developers understood the hardware better than ever before. Years of experience had transformed limitation into opportunities, clever techniques into second nature, and ambitious ideas into finished games. The machine hadn't suddenly become more powerful, the people creating games had simply become better at using it. That confidence could be felt almost everywhere. Some studios pushed atmosphere further than anyone thought possible, others experimented with new controls that completely changed the way people interacted with games. Racing became bigger, adventures became darker, role-playing games grew more ambitious, sports games found entirely new audiences, while developers with nothing left to prove began taking creative risks that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. The PlayStation wasn't repeating itself, it was evolving. Perhaps that's what makes 1999 such a fascinating year to revisit. On one side stood a console at the absolute height of its powers, surrounded by extraordinary games and millions of loyal players. On the other stood an industry already looking beyond it, chasing faster hardware, bigger worlds, and the promise of an entirely new generation. For a brief moment, both futures existed at the same time. The PlayStation was still the present, but the future had already stepped into the room. Most consoles spend their final years slowly fading into the background, overshadowed by whatever comes next. The original PlayStation refused. Instead, it answered the greatest challenge of its life in the only way it knew how, by producing some of the finest games it had ever seen. And that's what makes 1999 so remarkable. It wasn't the beginning, it wasn't the end, it was the moment the PlayStation stood at the top of the mountain, looked directly towards the future, and decided it had one more extraordinary year left to give.
Play Silent Hill. You may never leave your room again for PlayStation from Konami.
Fear has always reflected its time. The monsters people imagine, the stories they tell, and the nightmares they carry with them rarely stay the same for very long. As the millennium drew to a close, horror itself seemed to become quieter, less interested in making people jump, and far more interested in making them feel uncomfortable long after the television had been switched off. No PlayStation game captured that feeling better than Silent Hill. At first glance, Konami's newest horror game looked familiar enough. A lone protagonist, an abandoned town, strange creatures lurking somewhere ahead. It would have been easy to assume this was simply another attempt to follow the enormous success of Resident Evil. Within minutes, that illusion disappeared. The roads were empty, the streets vanished beneath an endless blanket of fog, a broken radio crackled without warning, filling the silence with static before anything could even be seen. Every footstep echoed through the deserted streets that somehow felt far more unsettling because they appeared so ordinary. There were no grand laboratories or secret underground facilities this time, just the forgotten American town where something felt terribly wrong. That uncertainty became the real monster. The fog itself was born partly from technical necessity. The original PlayStation couldn't draw an entire town stretching into the distance, so Konami concealed its limitations behind thick rolling mist. Yet what began as a practical solution quickly became one of gaming's greatest artistic decisions. The town never revealed itself all at once. Every street corner invented another question, every distant shape demanded another cautious step forward, and every familiar location somehow felt capable of changing without warning. The unknown became far more frightening than anything the player actually saw. Sounds played an equally important role. Instead of constantly warning players that danger was approaching, it drifted between haunted melodies, unsettling industrial noise, and long stretches of near silence. Sometimes the loudest sound was Harry Mason's own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Other times the world seemed to scream without explanation. Even today, a few seconds of that soundtrack are enough to transport many players straight back to Silent Hill's empty streets. Perhaps that's why the game endured for so long, not because of its monsters and not because of its combat, but because it trusted the player's imagination. It understood that the mind often creates fears far more convincing than any special effect ever could. 1999 became an extraordinary year for horror on the PlayStation. Capcom returned with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, but instead of simply repeating what had already worked, it shifted the genre into a more relentless direction. The introduction of Nemesis transformed familiar routines into constant uncertainty. Safe routes no longer felt safe. A quiet street could erupt into chaos without warning as the giant bioweapon crashed through walls or burst through the doors in pursuit of Jill Valentine. Rather than relying solely on limited ammunition and locked door puzzles, Resident Evil 3 created tension through pursuit, forcing players to make split-second decisions about whether to fight, flee, or simply survive. Nemesis quickly became one of gaming's most memorable antagonists, not because of what he was, but because the player never quite knew when he would appear. Capcom experimented again with Dino Crisis, proving survival horror didn't need zombies to remain frightening. Fast, intelligent dinosaurs replaced shambling undead, dramatically changing the pace of every encounter. Enemies hunted aggressively, reacted quickly, and punished hesitation in ways that felt completely different from the methodical rhythm of earlier horror games. It wasn't simply Resident Evil with dinosaurs, it was another attempt to explore how fear could be created through movement, speed, and unpredictability, showing that the genre still had plenty of room to evolve. Together, those games demonstrated just how varied horror became by the end of the decade, yet Silent Hill stood slightly apart from them all. It wasn't trying to overwhelm players with action or spectacle, it wanted them to feel isolated, confused, vulnerable. The town itself seemed alive, twisting reality without explanation and forcing players to question whether they were exploring a real place or something much darker hidden inside the human mind. Looking back, Silent Hill represented something larger than another successful PlayStation exclusive. It reflected the growing confidence of the platform itself. 5 years earlier, developers were still discovering what three-dimensional games could become. By 1999, they had started asking a different question: how could games make people feel? The answer wasn't always bigger explosions. Sometimes it was the sound of an empty street, a distant air raid siren, a radio suddenly cracking into life, and the slow realisation that the scariest thing in front of you wasn't the monster hidden in the fog. Success changes more than sales figures, it changes expectations. By 1999, developers no longer asked whether a game should come to the PlayStation, they asked how far they could push it. Only a few years earlier, Sony had been fighting for a place in the industry, now it had become the company everyone else measured themselves against. Publishers built their biggest projects around the PlayStation as a matter of course, while developers understood that if they wanted the widest possible audience, this is where they needed to be. The machine that had once arrived as an ambitious outsider had quietly become the centre of gaming. The numbers reflected just how dramatic the transformation had been. By the end of 1999, more than 70 million PlayStations had been sold worldwide. It was no longer simply a successful console, it had become one of the most influential entertainment products of the decade, sitting beneath televisions across the world and introducing millions of people to three-dimensional gaming. Its influence stretched far beyond the console itself. Memory cards preserved years of progress, arcade sticks found themselves beside fighting games, steering wheels became essential for racing enthusiasts, while specialist controllers appeared for genres that barely existed when the PlayStation first launched. The platform had grown into an entire ecosystem, one that players steadily built around as their collections expanded. The software library reflected that same maturity. Across shop shelves, the distinctive silver cases of the Platinum range sat alongside brand new releases, giving many of the PlayStation's greatest successes a second life at budget prices. New players could finally experience classics they had missed, while long-time owners found themselves adding to collections that already seemed impossibly large, and they really did seem impossibly large. One week that might be a psychological horror masterpiece, the next an addictive racing simulator, then a colourful platformer, an ambitious role-playing game, an arcade fighter, or a sports title capable of consuming entire weekends. The PlayStation no longer had to prove it could cater for different tastes, it simply became the place where every kind of player could find something worth remembering. That variety became one of Sony's greatest strengths. Konami, Square, Capcom, Electronic Arts, Namco, Naughty Dog, Crystal Dynamics, Psygnosis, and countless other studios all contributed something different. No single developer carried the platform, no single genre defined it, no single audience shaped its future. The PlayStation belonged to everyone. The conversation had changed too. Nobody questioned whether Sony deserved a place in the console industry anymore. That argument had been settled. Instead, people debated which game deserved their next purchase, which accessory best suited their favourite genre, and how a console released back in 1994 continued producing experiences that felt so contemporary. The remarkable thing was that the momentum never seemed to slow down. Years spent working with the hardware meant developers no longer devoted most of their energy to overcoming technical limitations. Those lessons had already been learned. Instead, studios refined mechanics, expanded worlds, improved storytelling, and polished ideas that would have seemed impossibly ambitious only a few years before. By 1999, the technology itself had quietly faded into the background. Players had remembered the atmosphere, the characters, the music, the adventures. The hardware had become almost invisible, allowing the games to take centre stage. By the close of the decade, Sony had reached the position that would have seemed almost unimaginable back in 1994. The PlayStation was no longer setting the industry, it was setting the standard. The only question that remained was whether anyone could finally catch it. As it turned out, the answer was already waiting just over the horizon.
Hi, my name is Robert Johnson. I am the Associate Marketing Manager here at Capcom Entertainment, and I'm here to show you today the Pocket Alpha 3 game for the new Sony PocketStation. I'm going to show you how the Japanese version works of the Pocket Alpha 3 game. Basically, what the PDA does is it is a little mini memory card peripheral that plugs right into your PlayStation and allows you to download the characters from your original Alpha 3 game onto the Pocket Alpha 3 game in order to build up the characters while you're on the road. And then once you have them built up, you can easily upload them back to the PlayStation in order to play those edited characters. Another cool feature about Pocket Alpha 3 is that you can fight against your friends. Just take it around, point it at your friends, and use the infrared communication device at the top here to play against your friends anywhere.
The PlayStation had already conquered the living room. By 1999, millions of grey consoles sat beneath televisions across the world, their memory cards filled with completed adventures, favourite racing cars and carefully protected save files that nobody dared overwrite. For most players, that was simply how gaming worked. You played until it was time to switch the console off, and the memory card quietly waited until the next session began. Sony had started imagining something different. What if a memory card could become more than somewhere to store progress? What if a game didn't have to end the moment you walked away from the television? Those questions led to one of the PlayStation's most unusual accessories, the PocketStation. At first glance, it looked almost ordinary. It plugged into the same memory card slot as every other save card. Yet hidden inside was a tiny monochrome screen, a handful of buttons, and enough technology to transform it into a miniature handheld system. Compatible games could transfer characters, unlock bonuses, collect items, and even play simple minigames away from the console itself, quietly expanding the PlayStation experience from beyond the living room. For players in Japan, it felt like a glimpse of tomorrow. For everyone else, it became something almost mythical. The PocketStation never received a widespread release outside Japan, meaning many Western players only knew it through magazine screenshots, import shops, or conversations on the early internet. It was one of those curious pieces of PlayStation history that seemed to exist just out of reach, intriguing enough to capture imaginations despite so few people ever holding one. The idea itself mattered more than the hardware. Sony wasn't alone in exploring portable companions. Sega's upcoming Dreamcast would introduce the visual memory unit, giving players another glimpse of a future where save data could travel with them. Suddenly, memory cards were becoming something more personal than simple storage devices. They were beginning to feel like companions. Looking back, neither idea completely changed gaming. The screens were tiny, the minigames were simple, battery life placed obvious limits on what these little devices could achieve, but perhaps that misses the point. The PocketStation wasn't trying to replace the PlayStation, it was asking a question: could gaming exist somewhere else? Long before smartphones, cloud saves, or companion apps, Sony was already experimenting with ways to keep players connected to their favourite games after they'd switched the console off. It was a small idea, quietly hidden inside a tiny white memory card, yet it hinted at a future that the industry would spend decades gradually exploring. Perhaps that's why the PocketStation remains so fascinating today. Not because it became a huge commercial success, not because every PlayStation owner rushed out to buy one, but because it captured something that defined Sony throughout the late 1990s: confidence. The company had reached a point where it no longer needed every new idea to become a global phenomenon. Sometimes it was enough to experiment, to build something unusual, to wonder where gaming might go next, even while the original PlayStation remains at the top of the industry. It was a reminder that the future wasn't only arriving through faster consoles and more powerful hardware. Sometimes it arrived in something small enough to fit in your pocket. And while Sony imagined where gaming would go tomorrow, developers were still finding remarkable new ways to surprise players today.
Ape Escape. You better get them before they get you.
Sometimes the biggest ideas arrive in the most unexpected packages. By 1999, players had spent years growing accustomed to the DualShock controller. The analog sticks had gradually become part of everyday gaming, quietly improving racing games, adventures and shooters until it became difficult to imagine playing without them. Yet for all their potential, they still weren't truly essential. Most games continued to support the older digital controller, treating analog controls as a welcome bonus rather than a requirement. Ape Escape changed that. For the first time, Sony released a PlayStation game that simply refused to work without the DualShock. It wasn't a gimmick, and it wasn't a hidden option tucked away in a settings menu. The entire adventure had been built around the idea that players now had two analog sticks at the fingertips. One controlled Spike as he ran, jumped and explored colourful environments. The other swung gadgets, aimed tools and captured the mischievous monkeys that had escaped through time. It felt surprisingly natural, almost as though this knew how games had always been meant to work. Looking back, it's difficult to imagine how unusual that decision really was. Sony was effectively telling millions of players that analog control was no longer the future, it was the present. Fortunately, the game itself more than justified that confidence. Beneath its cheerful art style and playful sense of humour lay one of the PlayStation's most inventive platform adventures. Every level encouraged exploration rather than simply racing towards the finish, rewarding curiosity with hidden monkeys that each behaved a little differently. Some fled the moment they spotted you, others fought back, a few seemed almost determined to embarrass you before finally being caught. It gave every encounter its own personality, that sense of invention carried through the gadgets themselves. A flying propeller, a remote control car, a slingshot, a stun cable and the iconic monkey net gradually expanded what players could do, making each new stage feel less like an obstacle course and more like a toy box filled with ideas waiting to be discovered. Instead of relying on bigger explosions or darker stories, Ape Escape found its identity through imagination. It also reflected something larger about the PlayStation in 1999. Sony no longer needed every major release to chase realism. Alongside psychological horror, cinematic adventures and sprawl and role-playing games, there was still room for bright colours, playful worlds and wonderfully ridiculous concepts. A game about travelling through time to capture helmet-wearing monkeys somehow sat comfortably beside Silent Hill, Final Fantasy VIII and Gran Turismo 2. Only the PlayStation's library could make that feel completely normal. Perhaps that's why Ape Escape remains so fondly remembered. Not because it sold the most copies, not because it became Sony's biggest mascot, because it quietly marked the moment when analog controls stopped feeling like an experiment and became something developers could confidently build entire games around. 5 years earlier, Sony had taken a chance on a new way to play. By 1999, that gamble had paid off. The hardware had finally caught up with the imagination of people using it. And with one determined boy, a net and an army of runaway monkeys, the PlayStation proved that even 5 years at the top, it could still surprise everyone. Not every surprise arrived with quiet footsteps through the fog. Some arrived wearing a monkey helmet and sprinting in the wrong direction. Sometimes a game arrives at exactly the right moment. By the end of the 1990s, skateboarding was beginning to move back into the spotlight. Street culture was everywhere. Baggy jeans, oversized trainers, chain wallets and skate videos had become part of everyday life for many teenagers. While extreme sports were finding larger audiences than ever before, it wasn't just another hobby anymore, it had become an identity. Then came Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. At first glance, the idea sounded surprisingly simple. Pick a skater, drop into a level, pull off as many tricks as possible before the timer reached 0. Yet within minutes, it became obvious that Neversoft had discovered something special. Every successful grind flowed naturally into another jump. Manuals hadn't arrived yet, but long combinations already felt possible through clever routing, confident timing, and a growing understanding of each environment. The controls seemed to disappear beneath your hands, leaving only rhythm, momentum, and one irresistible thought: one more run. That became the magic. Failure never felt frustrating because every mistake immediately suggested another attempt. You spotted a rail you hadn't reached before, a rooftop that suddenly looked possible, a gap you almost cleared. Every session quietly became another lesson, and every lesson ended with another restart. Hours disappeared without ever feeling wasted. Of course, the gameplay was only part of the story. Few games captured the sound of the late 90s quite like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Instead of orchestral scores or cinematic themes, players were greeted by licensed music that felt as though it had been lifted directly from somebody's CD collection. Punk, ska and alternative rock blasted through the speakers, giving every successful trick an energy that perfectly matched what was happening on screen. For many players, those songs became inseparable from the game itself, introducing artists they may never have discovered anywhere else. The soundtrack didn't simply accompany the action, it defined the atmosphere. Suddenly, games weren't only borrowing inspiration from films, they were borrowing from music, fashion and youth culture too. Perhaps that's why Tony Hawk's Pro Skater reached people who had never stepped onto a skateboard in their lives. It wasn't asking players to understand the sport, it was inviting them to enjoy the feeling, the speed, the creativity, the satisfaction of gradually mastering something that once seemed impossible. That confidence spread well beyond skateboarding. Sports games across the PlayStation library were becoming increasingly diverse. ISS Pro Evolution was laying the foundations for what would eventually become one of football's greatest rivalries, while wrestling fans fans spent countless evenings creating dream matches in WWF Attitude. Racing remained enormously popular, yet by 1999 the definition of a sports game had expanded far beyond football, racing and golf. The genre was becoming as varied as the audience itself. Looking back, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater represented something much bigger than another successful release. It proved that a video game could influence culture just as much as it reflected it. Players who had never heard of Tony Hawk suddenly knew exactly who he was. Skate parks became busier, tricks gained new names. Teenagers searched for skateboards after school, while others simply kept chasing impossible high scores from the comfort of the bedrooms. The game blurred the line between sport and entertainment in a way few titles had managed before. Perhaps that's why it still feels so fresh today. Not because every mechanic was revolutionary, not because every level was perfect, but because it understood something incredibly simple. Movement should feel joyful, mastery should feel satisfying, and a great soundtrack can make even another failed attempt feel like the beginning of your best run yet. The PlayStation had spent years proving it could tell unforgettable stories, create believable worlds, and redefine entire genres. Now it demonstrated something else. Sometimes all you needed was a skateboard, a countdown timer, and the promise that this next run would finally be the one. By the end of the 1990s, racing games had reached an interesting crossroads. Only a few years earlier, simply driving around a fully three-dimensional circuit was enough to leave players speechless. Developers were still learning what speed should feel like, how corners should flow, how a controller could recreate something as instinctive as driving a car. By 1999, those questions had already been answered. Now the challenge was something different. What kind of racing game did we want to make? Gran Turismo 2 represented one path. If the original game had convinced players that driving simulators belonged on home consoles, the sequel arrived determined to show just how far the idea could go. Hundreds of cars, dozens of manufacturers, countless championships, hours disappeared comparing upgrades, earning licenses, and slowly building a garage that felt less like a save file and more like a personal collection. For many players, finishing Gran Turismo 2 wasn't about reaching the credits, it meant reaching 100%. That pursuit became part of the experience, owning every car, winning every championship, finding the perfect setup. The game rewarded patience just as much as speed, turning thousands of players into collectors before they even realised it. Elsewhere, Naughty Dog offered a completely different take on racing. Crash Team Racing arrived with colourful tracks, ridiculous weapons and wonderfully tight controls. It proved that precision didn't have to mean realism. Every power slide, shortcut and perfectly timed boost felt rewarding, helping the game earn a reputation as one of the finest kart races ever released. It also marked the end of Naughty Dog's remarkable run with Crash Bandicoot before the studio moved on to entirely new adventures. Then there were the games that cared about nothing except speed. Roll Cage Stage 2 held futuristic vehicles around impossible circuits where walls and ceilings became part of the track. Meanwhile, other arcade racers continued chasing one simple goal: go as fast as the hardware would allow. Realism, simulation, pure spectacle, all of them could exist side by side. Nobody seemed interested in defining what a racing game should be anymore. They simply built the one they wanted, and that may have become the genre's greatest strength. Whether players wanted to collect hundreds of road cars, drift around cartoon tracks with friends, or race through anti-gravity circuits at impossible speeds, the PlayStation had an answer. Even the hardware reflected that confidence. Namco's force feedback Jog-Con, released alongside Ridge Racer Type 4, showed just how specialised the platform had become. It wasn't simply another controller, it was a racing peripheral built for players who wanted to feel even closer to the road. Only a few years earlier, that level of confidence would have seemed unimaginable. Looking back, perhaps 1999 wasn't the year racing became realistic. That story had already been told. It was the year they became complete. Developers no longer felt obligated to chase the same destination. Some pursued authenticity, some embraced chaos, others simply chased speed. Together, they created a racing library with a depth few consoles have ever matched. And the remarkable thing was that players never had to choose. They could spend an entire afternoon earning licenses in Gran Turismo 2 and even in Fire and Missiles in Crash Team Racing, then finish the night defining Gravity in Roll Cage Stage 2. 3 completely different ideas, 3 completely different experiences, one console. By 1999, the PlayStation wasn't simply home to great racing games, it had become home to almost every kind of racing game imaginable.
Coming this fall, the most anticipated action-adventure of the year. A story of one man's struggle to save mankind from extermination and his quest to win the heart of the woman he loves. An epic so stunning your emotions will stir, your heart will race, and your thumbs will be really, really sore. Final Fantasy VIII coming to a home theater near you. PlayStation.
Success can become its own greatest challenge. In 1997, Final Fantasy VII had done far more than become a hit. It had changed how many people thought about role-playing games. Millions of players discovered a genre they may never have considered before. By the time 1999 arrived, one question quietly hung over Square. How do you follow up a game that changed the industry? The answer wasn't to make the same game again. Instead, Final Fantasy VIII looked forwards. Everything felt bigger, the characters looked more realistic, the pre-rendered backgrounds became even more detailed, and the seamless blend into full motion video created moments that felt astonishing at the time. From the spectacular opening duel between Squall and Cypher to the unforgettable ballroom sequence that followed, Square once again showed a level of confidence few developers could match. Yet beneath those visual leaps sat a game willing to take risks. The Junction system asked players to think differently about character progression. Instead of following familiar rules, it rewarded experimentation. Some players embraced it immediately, others never truly warmed to it. Even today, discussions about Final Fantasy VIII often became debates about drawing magic, optimising characters, and whether its systems were misunderstood or simply too unconventional. Square could easily have replaced the formula that had already conquered the world. Instead, it chose to experiment. Looking back, that confidence feels like a perfect reflection on the PlayStation itself. By 1999, developers were no longer chasing safe ideas simply because they had worked before. Success had created room for ambition, and nowhere was that clearer than the role-playing genre. Chrono Cross arrived with one of the most beautiful worlds ever created on the original PlayStation. Its unforgettable soundtrack and huge cast of recruitable characters make it feel unlike anything else. Rather than revisiting the past, it explored new ideas, trusting players to embrace something far more thoughtful and unconventional. Meanwhile, Suikoden 2 quietly earned a reputation that only grew stronger with time. Its political storytelling, memorable characters, and emotional depth helped it become one of those rare games where reputation improved with every generation. It wasn't the loudest release of 1999, but for many role-playing fans, it became one of the very best. Elsewhere, Sony continued searching for a role-playing identity of its own. The Legends of Dragoon arrived in Japan as the company's most ambitious attempt yet to create a flagship RPG that could stand alongside the genre's biggest names. At the same time, Vagrant Story pointed towards another bold direction. Its intricate combat, mature storytelling, and technical achievements pushed the original PlayStation remarkably close to its limits. Together, these games revealed something important. Role-playing games on the PlayStation were no longer defined by a single masterpiece, they had become an entire ecosystem. Every major release explored different mechanics, different stories, different worlds. Instead of following one blueprint, developers were creating their own. One focused on romance and military academies, another explored parallel realities, another centered on political conflict, others experimented with time-based combat or deeply rewarding weapon systems. Players didn't simply have more role-playing games to choose from, they had more kinds of role-playing games. Perhaps that's the greatest compliment you can give the PlayStation in 1999. Only 2 years earlier, Final Fantasy VII had introduced many players to an entirely new genre. Now that same audience was eager to discover whatever came next. The PlayStation hadn't simply made role-playing games more popular, it had created a generation of players who wanted more. And Square, along with many other talented studios, seemed determined to reward that curiosity by refusing to stand still. In the end, perhaps Final Fantasy VIII never needed to become another Final Fantasy VII, it simply needed the confidence to become itself. That quiet confidence had become one of the defining qualities of the PlayStation as a whole, always moving forwards, never content by repeating yesterday's success.
Syphon Filter.
By 1999, players expected more from an adventure game. Bigger worlds, stronger stories, more believable characters. Simply running through one level to the next was no longer enough. Audiences had spent years growing alongside the PlayStation, and developers had grown with them. Every major release seemed determined to build somewhere worth getting lost in. Few games captured that ambition better than Syphon Filter. At first glance, it looked like another action game. Secret agents, military conspiracies, heavily armed enemies. By the end of the decade, those ideas were hardly new, but Ben's studio approached them with a confidence that made them feel entirely its own. Its missions stretched across city streets, embassies and hidden laboratories, stealth, gunfights, gadgets. The adventure was always changing, rarely staying predictable for long. Its weapons soon became part of playground legends. Few players who experienced Syphon Filter have forgotten the taser. Hold the trigger long enough and enemies eventually burst into flames. It was absurd, slightly cruel, and somehow unforgettable. Even decades later, it's still one of the first things people remember. What made this game stand out though was its pacing. One moment demanded patience and careful observation, the next exploded into frantic gunfights as alarms rang and enemies poured into the area. Rather than committing to one style of play, Syphon Filter constantly shifted gears. It kept players on the toes from beginning to end. Almost overnight, it became one of Sony's defining new franchises. Then there was legacy of Khan's Soul Reaver. If Syphon Filter looked towards blockbuster action, Crystal Dynamics looked somewhere far more haunting. The decaying world of Nosgoth felt ancient, mysterious, strangely alive. Its giant gothic architecture and forgotten ruins hinted at a civilization long past its prime. Exploring it felt less like moving through levels and more like uncovering the history of a lost world. Its greatest idea came through transformation. At almost any moment, Raziel could shift between the material world and the spectral realm. Hidden paths appeared, the environment changed shape, players had to think about space in completely different ways. Rooms twisted before your eyes, walls bent, doorways appeared where solid stone stood only moments before. It remains one of the PlayStation's most imaginative mechanics. Most impressive still, much of the world existed with remarkably little interruption. Instead of constantly stopping for loading screens, Soul Reaver flowed with a confidence that felt astonishing on hardware first released in 1994. It wasn't showing off, it simply let the journey continue. Perhaps that's what united these two very different games. Neither relied on a single gimmick. Both trusted the player to lose themselves in carefully crafted worlds where exploration mattered just as much as action. That ambition reached beyond those two adventures. Fear Effect approached storytelling from a completely different direction. Its use of continuously streaming video backgrounds created an atmosphere unlike anything else on the original PlayStation. The line between full motion video and traditional game environments began to blur. Combined with its cyberpunk style, mature themes and distinctive visual identity, it proved developers were still finding entirely new ways to present interactive worlds. Even as the console approached the end of the decade, elsewhere, Medal of Honor showed that history itself could provide the foundation for a blockbuster adventure. Guided in part by ideas from filmmaker Steven Spielberg, the game treated the Second World War with a seriousness that felt unusual on home consoles. It balanced cinematic action with quieter moments instead of relying on constant spectacle. Long before military shooters became one of gaming's defining genres, Medal of Honor was already laying many of the foundations. It showed that real history could inspire adventures every bit as compelling as science fiction or fantasy. By now, PlayStation adventures had become wonderfully difficult to define. Some focused on stealth, others on action, others on puzzles, exploration, storytelling. The common thread wasn't genre, it was ambition. Developers no longer seemed interested in asking what the PlayStation was capable of. They simply assumed it could bring ideas to life. Looking back, that's one of the clearest signs of how far the platform had come. 5 years earlier, developers were still discovering the possibilities of three-dimensional gaming. By 1999, they were building worlds that players genuinely wanted to inhabit, not because the hardware had changed, but because the focus had shifted away from solving technical problems and towards creating places players genuinely wanted to explore. With every remarkable adventure that arrived, the PlayStation kept proving something that had become almost unbelievable. Even after 5 extraordinary years, it hadn't run out of places to take us.
Pepsi, please!
One of the most interesting things about success is that it creates room for risk. When a platform is still fighting for attention, publishers naturally favour safe ideas, familiar genres, recognisable sequels, proven formulas. By the end of the 1990s, the PlayStation had reached a point where not every game needed to appeal to millions. There was room to experiment. Perhaps no game captured that spirit quite like Vib-Ribbon. At first glance, it barely looked like a PlayStation game. Thin white lines stretched across a black screen as a simple rabbit ran, jumped and stumbled through the abstract world. It felt closer to modern art than traditional game design. There were no detailed character models, no lavish backgrounds demanded attention. Everything relied on a rhythm, timing and imagination. Then came its greatest trick. Players could remove the game disc, insert one of their own music CDs, and watch the levels transform into entirely new challenges generated from the songs they chose. For 1999, it was an astonishing idea, quietly giving every player a slightly different experience. Elsewhere, experimentation took different forms. LSD Dream Emulator ignored almost every convention players expected from a video game. Instead, it invited them to wander through surreal dreamscapes that shifted and changed without explanation. There was no traditional objectives, no clear ending, and very little guidance. It remains one of the strangest titles ever released on the original PlayStation, yet it also shows a willingness to explore ideas somewhere between games, art, and interactive experiences. Then there was Pepsi Man. Only the late 1990s could have produced something quite so wonderfully peculiar. A superhero created to promote a soft drink somehow became the star of its own action game. Players sprinted through increasingly chaotic environments, dodging obstacles with relentless enthusiasm. It was silly, self-aware, and impossible to mistake for anything else. Not every experiment came from Japan. Devil Dice turned something as ordinary as rolling cubes into one of the PlayStation's cleverest puzzle games. It proved originality didn't always require huge budgets and spectacular visuals. Sometimes all it needed was one brilliant idea executed well. What united these games wasn't their genre, it was their willingness to be different. None of them felt designed by a committee, none seemed especially concerned by chasing the latest trends. They simply explored ideas their creators believed were worth making. Perhaps that became one of the PlayStation's greatest strengths. The console no longer relied solely on blockbuster releases to define its identity. Between the biggest names sat dozens of smaller projects, strange experiments, creative risks, ideas that gave the library a personality unlike anything else on the market. Not every experiment became a commercial success. Some quietly disappeared, others found passionate audiences over the years, players who approached just how different they dared to be. Looking back, those games reveal something important about the PlayStation's later years. Sony wasn't becoming more cautious. If anything, it was becoming more adventurous. Success had given developers permission to try ideas that might never have survived on a platform still fighting for its future. That spirit wasn't limited to the games film magazine covers. It could be found in the smallest and often the strangest ideas willing to surprise anyone willing to give them a chance. And I think that's why the PlayStation's library feels so distinctive today. It wasn't built around one kind of player. It wasn't built around one direction of success. It was built around curiosity. And in 1999, curiosity remains one of the industry's most powerful creative tools. The There are some years in gaming that become defined by a single masterpiece. 1999 wasn't one of them. What made the year remarkable wasn't one unforgettable release, it was the feeling that every major studio wanted to create the PlayStation game. By now, Sony no longer needed to convince developers to support the console. That battle had already been won. Now developers were competing with each other, not just for sales, for reputation. Capcom didn't just want another successful release. Konami wanted players talking about Silent Hill long after they finished Resident Evil. Polyphony Digital wanted racing games to be judged differently after Gran Turismo. Square wanted Final Fantasy VIII to prove that cinematic role-playing games could still evolve. Neversoft wanted to turn a niche American sport into something millions of people suddenly understood. Every studio seemed determined to leave a permanent mark on a console already overflowing with classics. That quiet rivalry changed the quality of the software. Nobody wanted to release a game that merely looked acceptable sitting beside Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2 or Gran Turismo. The standard had become much higher. Players expected polish, presentation, atmosphere, music, voice acting, memorable characters. Games weren't just competing for space on shop shelves anymore. They were competing for a place in people's memories. Perhaps that's why 1999 feels so relentless looking back. You barely had time to finish talking about one release before another arrived demanding attention. 1 month you were wandering through the fog-covered streets of Silent Hill. Soon afterwards, you were chasing impossible trick scores in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Then came Syphon Filter, Final Fantasy VIII, Crash Team Racing, Driver, Ape Escape, Chrono Cross, Dino Crisis, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, and dozens more. The remarkable thing wasn't simply the quality, it was how different they all were. Nobody seemed interested in copying one another. One studio chased realism, another chased horror, another chased speed, another chased storytelling, and another chased experimentation. The PlayStation had become large enough that developers no longer needed to make the same kind of game to find an audience. Success could look completely different depending on who was making it. That freedom gave the library an identity unlike anything that had come before. The PlayStation wasn't defined by one genre or one audience or one creative philosophy. It had become a place where widely different ideas could all succeed together. Looking back, that might have been Sony's greatest achievement. The company hadn't simply built the market leader, it had built a platform where developers constantly pushed each other to do better. Not because Sony demanded it, because every great release raised the bar for the next, and when every studio was trying to create the next classic, players are usually the ones who win.
Sega ネットゲーム。
ねえ、繋がってみない？
はい？
すごいんだから。ねえ、繋がろう。
いきなりそんな。
ネットゲームでみんながすごくなる。世界ネット RPG ファンタシースターオンライン。
By the summer of 1999, the mood across the games industry had begun to change. The original PlayStation was still delivering extraordinary games, magazines remained filled with glowing reviews, shop shelves showed little sign of slowing down, yet beneath that confidence, another conversation had quietly begun. People were starting to wonder, what came next? Events like E3 had always been a celebration of the present, but in 1999, they also became a glimpse of the future. Every booth promised something bigger, more polygons, more detailed worlds, new hardware, new possibilities. It was no longer enough to ask what games would arrive before Christmas. Players wanted to know what the next generation would look like. Sony found itself in a fascinating position. Unlike previous years, the company no longer needed to convince anyone that the PlayStation belonged. That battle had already been won. Instead, it faced a very different challenge. How do you celebrate one of the greatest years in your console's history while everyone keeps asking about the machine that comes next? It was an unusual balancing act. Developers arrived eager to show PlayStation games that looked more accomplished than ever. Meanwhile, journalists drifted towards a rumour surrounding Sony's next console. The present remained exciting, but the future had become impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, Sega approached the year in a very different energy. The Dreamcast had already launched in Japan. Preparations for its international release were gathering momentum. Demonstrations promised visuals that seemed astonishing for a home console. Talk of online features and arcade-perfect conversions suggested gaming was about to change once again. For the first time in years, Sony was no longer the only company shaping the conversation. Even away from the show floor, the feeling was unmistakable. Every magazine seemed to contain another rumour, another leak specification, another artist's impression of hardware that almost nobody had actually seen. As the calendar edged closer to the year 2000, more and more attention drifted beyond the original PlayStation. Yet perhaps that's what makes 1999 so remarkable. The future was impossible to ignore, and somehow the PlayStation refused to become yesterday's news. Instead of quietly fading into the background, it answered every new question with another outstanding game. Every prediction that its best days were behind it seemed to be answered by another reminder of just how much life remained inside the aging great console. Looking back, 1999 feels like one of the rare moments in gaming history when two generations briefly stood side by side. One has already changed the industry, the other promised to change it all over again. For players, it was an extraordinary time to be paying attention. Every month brought another masterpiece for the console, already sitting beneath the television. Every month also offered another glimpse of what might soon replace it. The future had never felt closer, yet the present had rarely felt stronger. And before Sony revealed what the future would become, another company was about to remind the entire industry just how quickly technology could move.
Watch this. I've got a plan. I can beat this thing. X. Why?
Think out loud. People might hear you.
It's thinking.
For 5 years, the PlayStation had shaped the conversation. Every major release, every sales milestone, every technological leap, they all seemed to revolve around Sony's great console. It had become so dominant that it was easy to forget something the games industry had always relied on: competition. Then on the 9th of September 1999, Sega reminded everyone. The Dreamcast launched across North America with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. The date itself was unforgettable, 9/9/99, but it was what the players saw on their television screens that left the greatest impression. Bright, colourful worlds filled with detail, arcade games that looked almost identical to their coin-operated counterparts, smooth animation, sharper textures, a level of visual clarity that immediately felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time since the original PlayStation launched, the future had a face. It wasn't simply another console, it was another generation. Games like Soul Calibur became instant showcases for what the new hardware could achieve. The fluid animation and visual fidelity felt astonishing to anyone accustomed to the aging PlayStation. Sonic Adventure finally carried Sega's mascot into a fully three-dimensional world. Power Stone transformed arena fighting into something energetic, unpredictable, and unlike anything else on the market. Sports fans were drawn towards NFL 2K and NBA 2K, whose presentation hinted at a future where television broadcasts and video games would increasingly borrow ideas from one another. Then there was Shenmue. Although it remained exclusive to Japan throughout 1999, stories about Yu Suzuki's ambitious project travelled around the world with remarkable speed. It was reported to be one of the most expensive games ever developed, living in towns, changing weather, fully voiced characters, a level of everyday detail that seemed almost impossible to imagine. Whether players experienced it firsthand or simply stared at magazine screenshots in disbelief, Shenmue quickly became one of the games that shaped expectations for the next generation. The Dreamcast wasn't simply selling software, it was selling possibility. Perhaps that was the greatest challenge facing Sony. The PlayStation remained home to an extraordinary catalogue of games. It still dominated sales, it still filled shop shelves, it still found new ways to surprise players. Yet standing beside Sega's new machine, there was no escaping the fact that time was beginning to catch up with the original hardware. For the first time, the PlayStation looked its age, and somehow that only made 1999 even more remarkable. While the industry marvelled at what tomorrow might bring, developers continued producing games that squeezed astonishing results from the hardware first released back in 1994. Silent Hill created fear through atmosphere rather than graphical power. Gran Turismo 2 expanded into one of the most ambitious racing games ever made. Final Fantasy VIII delivered spectacular cinematic moments. Soul Reaver quietly demonstrated technical ideas that few thought possible on the console. The PlayStation couldn't compete with the Dreamcast by matching its hardware, so it relied on something else: experience. 5 years of developers learning every strength, every weakness, every hidden trick had created a library that felt wonderfully complete. The Dreamcast represented incredible potential, the PlayStation represented mastery. Looking back, That's what makes this rivalry so fascinating. It wasn't simply old versus new, it was experience versus possibility. One console has already changed gaming, the other promised to change it again. For players, there was no wrong answer. Some rushed towards the excitement of a brand new generation. Others looked at the incredible games still arriving on the PlayStation and saw little reason to leave just yet. Both choices made perfect sense. History remembers the Dreamcast as the beginning of Sega's final chapter in the console business, but in 1999, nobody knew how that would end. What everyone did know was much simpler. For the first time in years, the PlayStation finally had a challenger worthy of sharing the spotlight.
コマーシャルで有名な湯川専務が綺麗に
One of the reasons 1999 feels so unforgettable is that greatness seemed to arrive from every direction. The PlayStation might have stood at the centre of the industry, but it certainly wasn't standing alone. Wherever players looked, somebody was trying to redefine what games could become. Nintendo continued carving out an identity that felt completely different from Sony's. While the PlayStation leaned towards cinematic adventures, psychological horror, and increasingly mature storytelling, the Nintendo 64 remained unapologetically focused on bringing people together. Super Smash Bros. Introduced a crossover few could have imagined only a few years earlier, inviting Nintendo's best-known characters into joyful battles that quickly became living room favourites. Mario Party turned friendships into fierce rivalries through deceptively simple minigames. Meanwhile, Pokemon Stadium finally brought the world's biggest phenomenon onto home consoles, letting players see their teams come to life in 3 dimensions. Elsewhere, Rare continued showing why it had become one of the industry's most respected studios. Donkey Kong 64 expanded the collectathon platform into extraordinary scale. Jet Force Gemini proved the studio was just as willing to experiment beyond familiar formulas. Nintendo's future looked very different from Sony's, yet it felt every bit as confident. Away from the consoles, personal computers were enjoying an extraordinary year of their own. Competitive players found themselves choosing between Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament, 2 shooters whose rivalry helped shape online multiplayer for years to come. Strategy fans were treated to Age of Empires 2 and the breathtaking scale of Homeworld. Role-playing fans discovered the philosophical storytelling of Planescape Tournament. Meanwhile, System Shock 2 quietly redefined immersive first-person design, planting ideas that countless games would build on for decades. Even creativity found new ways to flourish. Chris Sawyer's Roller Coaster Tycoon, developed almost entirely by one programmer, invited players to build, manage and obsess over their own amusement parks with remarkable freedom. It proved that landmark games didn't always require cutting-edge graphics or enormous development teams. Sometimes, one brilliant idea was enough. Looking back, that's what made 1999 feel so extraordinary. The industry wasn't moving in one single direction, it was moving in dozens. Console manufacturers challenged one another with new hardware, developers experimented with fresh ideas, personal computers pushed online gaming, strategy and simulation to new heights. New franchises quietly laid the foundations for decades to come. For players, it meant something wonderfully simple. Whatever game you loved, 1999 probably gave you one you'll never forget. Perhaps that's why the year continues to hold such a special place in gaming history. It wasn't defined by one platform or one company or even one generation. It was a rare moment when creativity seemed to flourish everywhere you looked. The future had never looked brighter. The only question now was who would lead it into the new millennium. By the closing months of 1999, it felt as though the entire industry had reached the crossroads. Behind it stood one of the most extraordinary decades gaming had ever experienced. Ahead lay a future filled with promises that sounded almost impossible. More realistic worlds, smarter artificial intelligence, cinematic storytelling on an entirely different scale, hardware powerful enough to leave the limitations of the 1990s behind. Everybody wanted to know what came next. Sony already had the answer. The company had spoken cautiously about its successor throughout the year, but as details slowly emerged, it became obvious this wasn't being presented as a simple replacement for the original PlayStation. It was a statement of intent. If the first console had earned Sony a place in the industry, this new machine was designed to keep it there. At the centre of that vision sat an ambitious new processor with an equally ambitious name, the Emotion Engine. Even before most people understood what it actually did, the name alone captured imaginations. It suggested a future where games could become more believable, more expressive, more cinematic than anything players had experienced before. Developers spoke about larger worlds, more detailed characters, possibilities that sounded almost limitless. Then there was another feature that reached far beyond gaming: DVD. At a time when standalone DVD players remained expensive household purchases, Sony's next console promised to play films as well as games. Suddenly, buying a console no longer felt like purchasing a single-purpose machine. It looked increasingly like the centre of an entire home entertainment system. The conversation quickly changed. Magazine covers filled with speculative renders, early demonstrations and bold predictions about the generation to come. Every new interview revealed another ambitious promise. Every trade show encouraged players to imagine what their favourite series might become on more powerful hardware. The excitement was impossible to ignore, yet something remarkable happened during all our anticipation. The original PlayStation refused to disappear. Even as attention drifted towards the PlayStation 2, Sony's aging grey console continued producing games that many publishers would have proudly used to launch an entirely new system. It was an extraordinary position to be in. One machine represented the future, the other was still delivering some of the finest experiences of its generation. Few companies have ever managed that transition so gracefully. Looking back, perhaps that's the greatest achievement of 1999. It wasn't simply another successful year, it proved the original PlayStation had become something much larger than the hardware itself. Developers understood it completely, players trusted it, publishers believed in it. The PlayStation had reached the rare point where success no longer depended on novelty, it depended on everything that had been built over the previous 5 years. A library unlike any other, developers who knew every strength and every limitation of the hardware, and players who knew that another remarkable game was never far away. Perhaps that's why 1999 occupies such a unique place in PlayStation's history. It was the moment one generation looked towards the next without letting go of the present. There was excitement, curiosity, expectation, and very little urgency, because despite everything the industry had seen throughout the year, the original PlayStation still felt far from finished. That, more than anything else, speaks to the extraordinary strengths of its library. A weaker console might have faded quietly into the background. The PlayStation answered the future with Silent Hill, with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, with Gran Turismo 2, with Final Fantasy VIII, with Ape Escape, with Soul Reaver, with Syphon Filter, with one of the greatest software lineups any console has ever assembled. And somehow, it still wasn't finished. Another year remained, more remarkable games were waiting. The PlayStation story wasn't ending, it was evolving. As one millennium drew to a close and another prepared to begin, Sony stood in a position that would have seemed almost unimaginable back in 1994. No longer the outsider, no longer the challenger, but the company everyone else was trying to catch. The next generation was coming, the future was almost here, and the original PlayStation still had a few more stories left to tell. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey through the history of the original PlayStation, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like. It helps these documentaries reach more people who share the same passion for retro gaming, and every bit of support genuinely makes a difference. If you're new here, consider subscribing and joining us as we continue documenting the complete history of the PlayStation, year by year, game by game, all the way to the end of its remarkable journey. If you'd like to experience the story from the very beginning, you'll find the full playlist linked below, from Sony's uncertain arrival in the console industry back in 1994 to the incredible library that follows. Every episode builds on the last, and we're still only getting started. Finally, a huge thank you to the amazing members of the channel. Your support helps make these documentaries possible, and I genuinely couldn't create them without you. I've been Parasine, the history continues.
Rated E for everyone, or T for teens.
Boom.